He had exactly 11 minutes left before the world he had built over 20 years collapsed into rubble around him. He didn't know that yet. Nobody ever does. Officer Troy Harlan of the Pine Ridge Police Department sat in his cruiser on a Tuesday afternoon in August, parked in the gravel turnout behind the old Colton Law billboard on Route 9, sipping lukewarm sweet tea through a gas station straw and watching the highway the way a hawk watches an open field. Not for danger, not for crime, for opportunity. Pine Ridge, Alabama was the kind of town that didn't make maps worth studying. 1,800 souls, one stoplight, 2 churches that couldn't agree on anything, and a police department that had spent 2 decades confusing fear with respect. The summer heat here didn't arrive, it settled. It pressed down on everything with the slow, patient weight of something that knew it had already won. The air smelled like red clay and cut grass, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when a community has learned to stop complaining. Troy Harlan was 46 years old. He had a gut that arrived at doorways a half second before the rest of him, a buzz cut that had retreated to the middle of his skull like a tide going out, and a uniform that strained at the chest in a way that said more about ego than muscle. He had the face of a man who had once been told he was intimidating and had spent the next 2 decades trying to live up to it. In Pine Ridge, Troy wasn't just a patrolman. He was the architecture of the place, invisible but load-bearing. The younger officers watched the way he walked through a room and tried to copy it. The dispatcher, old Mrs. Higgins, never asked him for probable cause because she had learned long ago that asking Troy Harlan to explain himself led to 3 days of cold silence. The businesses on Main Street kept their heads down when his cruiser rolled past, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had learned that innocence was not the same thing as protection. They called him the Hammer at the Rusty Nail, which was the only bar in town worth the name. Troy had overheard the nickname 12 years ago and had immediately privately loved it. A hammer didn't negotiate. A hammer didn't second-guess. A hammer came down on things, and the things broke. He had built a philosophy around this, not a complicated one, but a durable one. The moment someone in this town stopped being afraid of him was the moment he lost control of all of them. 20 years on the force. 2 commendation plaques on the wall of his office. 4 complaints filed against him, none of which had made it past Chief Dolby's desk. 2 internal investigations that had dissolved like sugar in warm water. He was by all official measures a good cop. By all human measures, he was something significantly more complicated. He drained the last of his sweet tea. The ice had long since melted. He shifted in the driver's seat and the leather groaned beneath him, and he looked out at the highway the way he always looked at it, not as a public road, but as his road, his jurisdiction, the place where if you were the right kind of wrong, he would find you. He wasn't looking for a drug runner. He wasn't looking for a drunk driver or a stolen vehicle. He was looking for the specific kind of vehicle that had over the course of his career come to represent something particular to him, expensive, out of place, driven by someone who looked like they didn't belong in Pine Ridge and knew it. He was bored. And for a man like Troy Harlan, boredom was the most dangerous condition possible. That was when he saw it. An obsidian black Range Rover newest model, the kind that reflected sunlight like a mirror rather than simply catching it. Moving north on Route 9 at exactly 35 miles per hour. Precise, deliberate, not a mile over the speed limit. Troy leaned forward. In his mind, in the deep-grooved neural pathways worn smooth by 2 decades of unchecked bias, a vehicle like that driven by someone who looked like that moving through Pine Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon meant one thing. It was a reflex, not a thought. A conclusion that arrived before the evidence did because the evidence in Troy's private calculus was never really necessary. He set the empty cup in the holder. He watched the Range Rover slow at the crossroads signal properly and continue north. He put the cruiser in drive. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled out onto the highway, and something in his chest settled into a familiar, comfortable hum, the feeling of a predator that has selected its target and begun to move. He had no idea that the target had selected him first. As his cruiser accelerated onto Route 9, Troy let his mind run over the arithmetic the way a man checks his wallet before paying automatically without real thought. He called it the road tax. Not out loud, not to anyone. But in his head, that was the name for it. The idea was simple. Some people passed through Pine Ridge contributing nothing. They drove their expensive cars on roads his department maintained through a community that his badge helped hold together, and they gave nothing back. The road tax was the correction for this imbalance, an informal toll, a cost of passage for people who had the wrong kind of money in the wrong kind of town. In Troy's private theology, this wasn't theft. It was equilibrium. He was a corrections officer in the truest sense, correcting the imbalance between what people like him were owed and what they received. He had said this to Colton once 3 drinks in at the Rusty Nail, and Colton had looked at him with the particular expression of a lawyer who has just heard someone confess to something useful and is determining how to file it. It had started small the way these things always do. A search, some cash found in a console that mysteriously found its way into an evidence bag that was never logged. A possession charge that could be made to disappear for the right kind of cooperation. Then, he had met Arthur Colton at a Rotary Club dinner 8 years ago, and small had become systematic. Colton ran a personal injury practice out of a converted Victorian on Main Street, his face on a billboard at the north end of Route 9. The arrangement they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Troy would stop a car, always someone passing through, never a local, never someone who might complain to someone who mattered. He would find a reason to detain them. If they had cash, some of it stayed with Troy. If they had insurance, Colton would have a runner at the jail within the hour offering representation for a civil lawsuit. The cases settled quietly out of court, and the money split 3 ways, Colton Troy and a smaller cut that moved to Chief Dolby's private account through a contractor shell company that nobody looked at twice. He thought about Marcus Beaumont sometimes. Not with guilt required an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that Troy had never quite arrived at, but with a kind of baseline clarity. Marcus had been 44, a pharmaceutical sales rep from Tuscaloosa, driving a company-leased Infiniti through Pine Ridge on his way to a client meeting in Huntsville. Troy had stopped him on a pretextual lane change violation, found $700 in a money clip in the console. Marcus's weekly travel allowance documented in his work phone's expense app, and taken $400 of it by threatening to seize the vehicle on suspicion of drug proceeds. Marcus had been so stunned that he had simply handed over the bills and driven away. He probably never told his wife. That was the beautiful efficiency of the road tax. Shame was as useful as any legal mechanism. People who were taken from did not run to the police. The police were the ones who had taken from them. He thought about Eddie Garrett, 32 delivery driver from Montgomery, passing through in a company van. $240 out of his wallet, his grocery money for the month. Troy had taken it without a second thought and spent it on new tires for his base boat. Jerome Tate was different. Jerome had been the one that occasionally surfaced in Troy's mind at 2 in the morning when the house was quiet, and the certainty that usually armored him had thinned. Jerome had fought back legally in the language that Troy had been certain people like Jerome didn't speak. He had gotten a lawyer. Not a good one, not one good enough to win, but one good enough to ask the right questions. And so Troy had been more careful with Jerome than he usually was. He had called in a favor from Dr. Raymond Sills, a county physician who had over the years provided certain flexible services in exchange for certain flexible interpretations of the law. The DUI conviction had cost Jerome his commercial driver's license, his job, his house, his marriage, his son's certainty about his father. Troy had told himself Jerome shouldn't have fought back. 47 cases in 5 years. Troy knew the number. He had counted once on a slow night and felt something that was not quite pride, but was close enough that he hadn't examined the difference. The billboard slid past on his left. Arthur Colton's face, tanned, silver-haired, reassuring, smiled down at the highway from 20 feet up. Injured, call Colton. We fight for you. Troy watched the Range Rover continue north. Nice car, tinted windows, Atlanta plates. He pressed the accelerator. Calvin Reese had been fixing cars in Pine Ridge for 23 years, which meant he had been watching Pine Ridge for 23 years, which meant he had seen things accumulate the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river, gradually, invisibly. Until one day, you looked down and realized you were standing in mud up to your knees. His garage sat on the north end of town, a corrugated metal building with 3 bays and a hand-painted sign that said Reese Auto in letters that had faded from red to a dignified rust orange. He was 50 years old, wide through the shoulders, with hands that were permanently stained at the cuticles with engine grease that no amount of industrial soap fully removed. His wife said it was like trying to wash away history. She wasn't wrong. Calvin knew every car in Pine Ridge the way a shepherd knows every sheep. He knew which ones were limping, which ones were in denial about needing new rotors, which ones belonged to whom. He knew the sound of Troy Harlan's cruiser, specifically a slight rattle in the right front suspension that Troy had refused to fix for 3 years because he liked the sound it made when he drove slowly past a house he wanted to remind someone he was watching. He had seen things over 23 years. He had seen families he had known his whole life quietly move away from Pine Ridge one by one, not because they wanted to leave, but because the mathematics of staying had become impossible. He had seen the specific choreography of a man noticing Troy's cruiser in his mirror and going very still in the way of a person recalibrating everything. Speed, posture, facial expression in the single second before the lights came on. He had watched that choreography so many times it had become as unremarkable as weather. That was the thing about 20 years it wore you down to acceptance in the same way water wears stone. And he had seen Jerome Tate. That one he could not set aside. Jerome had been his neighbor for 11 years, the kind of neighbor who brought your mail inside when it rained without being asked. A solid man. A father who showed up to every school play and every little league game with a cooler full of drinks for the whole team. A commercial driver with a CDL that he had studied for twice because he failed the first time and had not considered quitting. Jerome Tate had worked hard in the way that people work hard when they understand that the margin for error is thin, and getting thinner and working hard is the only variable they can control. Troy had stopped Jerome on a Thursday night 14 months ago. Calvin had heard about it from Jerome the following morning, standing in the garage bay with a cup of coffee. Going cold in his hand, his voice very flat and very careful in the way that people's voices get when they are reporting something terrible and have decided in advance not to cry about it. Jerome had not been drinking. He had come from a birthday dinner at his mother's house, stone sober, driving at the speed limit with working turn signals and no violations. Troy had pulled him over, put him through a field sobriety test that Jerome passed, and then called Dr. Sills, who arrived in his personal car 20 minutes later and administered a blood alcohol test that, according to the official record, showed a reading of 0.09, barely over the legal limit. Conveniently enough to prosecute carefully enough not to draw scrutiny. Jerome had lost his CDL. His employer, a regional freight company, had terminated him immediately. He had been making $67,000 a year. He was now making $19,000 across 3 jobs: warehouse, overnight landscaping, on weekends, food delivery on the app when his back held out. The house went 3 months after the job did. His wife Tanya had lasted another 4 months after that, trying to hold the family together on 2 incomes while Jerome pieced himself back together, and then she had reached the limits of what holding on cost her, and she had left on a Sunday morning with the 2 boys for what she said was a visit to her sister. She had not come back. Jerome was living in a 1-room apartment above the hardware store on Clement Street, paying $400 a month directly above the loading dock, where delivery trucks arrived at 5:30 every morning. Calvin had gone to the FBI 6 months ago. It had taken him 3 months to decide to do it, 2 more to find the right contact, and 1 more before someone called him back. When they did, it was a woman named Agent Reyes, who had listened to everything he said with a patience he had not expected, and had then asked very specific questions about Arthur Colton's billing practices and Chief Dolby's financial disclosures. Today was the day. He looked at the clock above the tool chest, 2:47 p.m. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He looked north up Route 9. And then he saw in the distance the silent pulse of blue lights. His stomach dropped. He grabbed his phone and texted 3 letters to a number he had memorized in Birmingham, GO. Agent Lena Reyes, 2 miles north in the back office of Calvin's garage, looked at her screen. She pressed record on both camera feeds simultaneously. They had chosen the Range Rover specifically. Marcus had wanted something Troy would not be able to resist. The previous evening, Agent Reyes had helped them affix 2 cameras to the vehicle, one embedded in the rear-view mirror, housing one in the front grille, both transmitting live encrypted feed to a receiving unit in Calvin's garage. A third device, no larger than a coat button, was sewn into the lining of Deja's blazer lapel, carrying a directional microphone sensitive enough to capture a whispered conversation at 6 feet. Troy Harlan had been under federal electronic surveillance for 11 weeks. His phone, his vehicle, his conversations with Colton at the Rusty Nail every other Thursday. The wiretap warrants had been signed by federal magistrate Judge Cornelia Oates in Birmingham, bypassing the local judiciary entirely because every local judge in Mercer County had received at one time or another a courtesy call from Chief Dolby. They had enough for Colton. They had enough for Dolby. They had enough for Dr. Sills. They were 3 weeks from having enough for Mayor Fenn and the Shell Company. What they needed was Troy on camera, on audio, in his natural state, doing what he did to 2 people who had every right in the world to be on that road. Marcus Webb was 48 years old. He had the build of someone who had played linebacker in college and maintained most of it through discipline rather than vanity-wide, through the chest arms that filled the sleeves of the gray t-shirt he was wearing. A face that was simultaneously open and unreadable, which was a useful combination in his line of work. He was the special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office, a title that came with a great deal of responsibility, and on days like today, the particular controlled adrenaline that he had never learned to fully metabolize. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other rested on the center console. Beside him, Deja Webb had the passenger window open 2 inches, letting the Alabama heat pull through her hair. She was 44 years old and had her mother's jawline and her father's eyes, which were dark and very still, and gave the impression of someone who was always 3 steps ahead of whatever room she was in. She wore the navy blazer over a white shirt, her hair pulled back in a professional bun. She was a senior prosecutor with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and she had personally requested this assignment 11 months ago, which had raised exactly 1 eyebrow from her supervisor and no further questions once he read the brief she had prepared. She was looking out the window at the flat Alabama landscape, the scrub pines, the red clay shoulders, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with an expression that Marcus had learned over a lifetime of knowing her meant she was working through something private. "You're thinking about Dad," he said. She didn't deny it. "I'm thinking about how he used to get very quiet on road trips through places like this. We'd be talking laughing music on, and then we'd cross a county line into somewhere like Pine Ridge, and he'd just go quiet, turn the music down, both hands on the wheel." Marcus didn't say anything. "I found the file when I was cleaning out his house," Deja said, after he passed. "Buried in a shoebox in the closet, which you would think is a strange place for a man to keep a legal document. But if you understand why he wanted it hidden from us when we were children, it makes perfect sense." She paused. 1987. He was stopped on Route 9, actually not this road, but one exactly like it 60 miles south. Held for 6 hours. No charge, no ticket, no explanation given. Just 6 hours sitting on the side of the road in the heat while men with badges did whatever they felt like doing. She turned from the window. He never told us. Not once in 30 years. He just got quiet at county lines. The file, Marcus said. Was there anything else with it? Deja was quiet for a moment. There was a note, she said, in his handwriting, addressed to both of us. Another pause longer. He had written it after 1987, sometime when we were young. He kept it in that shoebox for decades and never gave it to us. It said, "I need you both to understand that what happened to me happened to a lot of people. And the only thing I know for certain is that the people who can do something about it have to decide that it's worth the cost. I hope you'll decide that." Marcus said, "That's why you asked for this case. That's why I asked for this case." They rode in silence for a moment. The GPS showed 2 miles to the billboard. "He's already watching us," Marcus said. Not a question. He's been watching since we passed the water tower. Deja settled back in her seat, folded her hands in her lap, and let her face go professionally neutral, the expression she wore in federal courtrooms, in depositions in rooms where men with power had decided to test whether she would flinch. Calvin has the feed. Agent Reyes has the feed. Everything from this point forward is evidence. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. The gravel turnout behind the Colton billboard was visible for just a moment as they crested a low rise in the road, and in it, barely distinguishable from the shadow of the sign, he could make out the shape of a police cruiser. The cruiser was moving. "He's already pulling out," Marcus said. Deja nodded once. She looked straight ahead at the empty highway, at the heat shimmer above the asphalt, at the flat Alabama afternoon that appeared to any casual observer to be a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. "Let him come," she said. The blue lights came on without the siren, just the silent, strobing authority of them, filling the rearview mirror like a threat that hadn't decided yet how serious it was going to be. Marcus checked the mirror, signaled right, pulled the Range Rover onto the dusty shoulder near the old Baptist church with the hand-painted sign out front that read, "Grace is free, but parking is limited." He killed the engine, put both hands on the wheel where they could be seen, hit the hazard lights. Precise? Correct. Every procedure exactly right. In Calvin's garage 2 miles north, Agent Reyes watched the live feed on a laptop screen and quietly confirmed recording protocols on both channels. Troy pulled his cruiser in behind them, angled slightly. He spent 45 seconds in the vehicle before getting out longer than necessary, which was how he calibrated his entrances. He wanted the people in the car to be thinking about him before he arrived. He wanted the waiting itself to be the first act of control. He came up on the passenger side, always the passenger side. It rotated the driver toward him, put them in an awkward position, disrupted the natural geometry of a traffic stop. He had learned this from a senior officer when he was 26 and had never stopped using it because it worked. He knocked on the window, 3 sharp raps, the knock of a man who expects the door to open. The glass came down. The interior of the Range Rover was cold, the air conditioning running high, and it smelled like new leather and nothing else. No fast food wrappers, no air freshener, no loose papers or gas station receipts. The kind of clean that takes effort, which Troy noted and filed away as suspicious, because everything was evidence of something if you needed it to be. The woman in the passenger seat looked at him over the rims of her sunglasses. She was striking sharp features, professional bun navy blazer. Her eyes, when they met his, were not frightened. They were precisely, pointedly unimpressed. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was articulate and even, and held no trace of the performance of deference that Troy had come to expect and quietly require. "License and registration." He didn't answer her question. Answering questions meant acknowledging that the other person had a right to ask them. He leaned forward slightly, letting his presence fill the window. Past the woman, he looked at the driver. The man was large, genuinely large, with broad shoulders and arms that rested easy on the wheel. Gray t-shirt, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. A face that was, if anything, more perfectly composed than the woman's. Not calm in the way of someone managing fear. Calm in the way of someone who has none. Troy didn't like that kind of calm. It felt like a challenge. "I asked you a question," Troy said, his voice dropping half an octave. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "We were doing 35, the driver said. His voice was low and unhurried, a baritone that carried without effort. "Signal was on, plates are valid, insurance is current. I pulled you over because you've got an obstruction on your mirror." Troy pointed at the rear-view mirror. "That thing hanging there." There was nothing hanging from the rear-view mirror. The driver glanced at the mirror, then back at Troy. "There's nothing on the mirror, officer." "Don't get smart with me, boy." The word came out easily. It always came out easily. It was a compression of a much longer statement, a statement about hierarchy and who was permitted to speak, and in what register collapsed into a single syllable that Troy had used so many times it had become thoughtless. He preferred his power deployed without conscious decision so that it felt like weather rather than choice. He saw the woman's jaw tighten. He saw the driver's hands apply the faintest additional pressure to the leather. License and registration. "Now," Kendrick, the woman said quietly, "just give it to him." "The driver." Kendrick reached slowly toward the center console. "Hands," Troy shouted, stepping back and dropping his right hand to the grip of his Glock. "I want to see hands on the dashboard. Now I'm getting my wallet." Kendrick stopped moving. His hands returned to the wheel, open palms forward. "You asked for ID. My wallet is in the center console." "I don't know what you're reaching for." Troy's voice shifted into a different register, louder, building the narrative of a tense encounter where the officer had every reason to be afraid. "Get out of the car. Both of you. Out. Now." The woman said, "Officer, this is unnecessary. We are fully complying with—" "Get out or I will remove you." Last warning. Another silence. The driver and the woman exchanged a glance that Troy could not read. Not fear, not anger. Something precise and wordless, the way people who trust each other completely communicate things that don't require language. "Okay," the driver said. "We're stepping out." They opened their doors and stepped onto the shoulder. The Alabama heat came down on them immediately, the flat, indifferent press of it, the red dust rising around their shoes. Neither of them flinched. They stood by the side of the car with their hands clearly visible, their posture upright. They looked less like two people being pulled over and more like two people observing something they had anticipated. "Hands on the hood," Troy ordered. "Spread." The driver placed his large hands on the hot metal of the hood. The woman did the same. Troy moved to the driver first. He kicked the man's feet apart harder than necessary, the kind of kick that was half instruction and half demonstration, and patted him down with the thoroughness of someone who expects to find something. Waistband, pockets, inner thighs. He was looking for a weapon or a bag, anything he could use as the foundation for a more serious stop. He felt a hard rectangle in the back pocket. "What's this?" "My wallet," the driver said, "which contains the identification you asked for." Troy pulled it out. He didn't open it. He tossed it onto the hood of the car face down and moved to the woman. "Officer," her voice was flat and authoritative, "I do not consent to a search. You have no probable cause." "I have probable cause because your partner here is being combative." He reached for her arm. "Do not touch me." It was not a scream. It was not particularly loud. It was a command, the kind of statement delivered by someone who has authority so deeply internalized that they have stopped needing to perform it. It stopped Troy for 1 full second, which was a second longer than anything usually stopped him. He leaned forward until his face was close to her ear, close enough that he was speaking only to her. "You're in Pine Ridge now," he said. "The Constitution ends at the county line. I can do whatever I want." The button mic sewn into her lapel captured it in perfect, crisp clarity. He grabbed her arm and turned her. He patted her down quickly, rough, impersonal, the kind of search conducted by someone demonstrating power rather than looking for anything specific. He found nothing. He stepped back. "Stay right there. You move, I tase you." He walked around to the driver's side of the Range Rover and opened the door. He went through the center console first, a pack of mints, a charging cable, a pair of sunglasses in a case. Nothing. He opened the glove box, insurance papers, rental agreement, the car's registration. He reached under the driver's seat. His hand touched something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a Sig Sauer P365 matte black finish standard capacity magazine. He scrambled out of the car, holding it up. "Gun," he shouted. "Gun on the ground. Both of you on the ground now." He leveled his own weapon at the driver's chest. The driver did not drop. He straightened up from the hood slowly and turned to face Troy. His face was not frightened. It was etched with something dark and deliberate, the expression of a man who has arrived at a threshold and made his decision about what comes next. "Officer," the driver said, and his voice was very quiet and very steady. "Put that firearm down. The weapon you're holding is legal and registered. On the ground or I will drop you. You are under arrest for illegal possession of a concealed weapon." "It's not illegal," the woman said. Her hands were still raised, but her eyes were tracking Troy's trigger finger with a precision that should have meant something to him. "Open the wallet you threw on the hood. Open it. I don't need your fake IDs." He keyed his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Alpha. I need backup on Route 9 at the Baptist Church. 2 suspects at gunpoint. Weapon recovered. Send everyone. You are making a mistake that will cost you everything." The driver's voice had not risen by a single decibel. "There is a badge holder attached to the belt of that weapon. Look at it." Troy glanced at the gun in his left hand. He hadn't pulled the whole assembly, just the weapon. The holster was still under the seat, and clipped to the holster strap was a small leather holder he had missed entirely. He could see the edge of something gold and official-looking inside it. "Shut up," Troy said. In the distance, sirens. His backup was coming. He felt for one blazing moment completely in control. He had no idea that control was a thing he had already lost. Deputies Riley and Briggs arrived in 2 separate cruisers, pulling up behind Troy's vehicle, with the particular urgency of officers responding to a call from the person they feared most in the department. Deputy Sandra Oakes arrived in a 3rd car 30 seconds later, and she took one look at the 2 people standing at the hood of the Range Rover, hands up, composed, neither struggling nor afraid, and something cold moved through her stomach. "Cuff them," Troy ordered Riley. "Resisting arrest. Illegal firearm." Riley moved to the driver, and the driver said clearly and loudly, "I am a federal agent. My badge is in the wallet on the hood of that car. If you place handcuffs on me, you are committing the federal crime of kidnapping a law enforcement officer." Riley stopped, looked at Troy. "He's lying," Troy said. "They all say that." "Cuff him." Riley snapped the cuffs on. Click, click. Deputy Briggs moved toward the woman. She allowed herself to be cuffed, her eyes never leaving Troy's face. She was memorizing him every detail, the badge number on his chest, the sweat pattern on his collar, the way his hands shook slightly as the adrenaline began to metabolize into something less certain. "Check the wallet," Oakes said quietly from behind Troy. "What?" "The wallet." "Troy." "On the hood." "It's procedure. We're supposed to verify ID." "I know procedure, Oakes." "Then follow it," she said. And there was something in her voice, not defiance exactly, but the sound of a person who has been silent for too long and has just decided that today is not the day to continue. Troy picked up the wallet. He turned it over in his hands. He told himself he was going to find a Georgia driver's license, maybe a library card, something that would vindicate the whole afternoon. He flipped it open. The badge was solid brass heavy and detailed an eagle with spread wings across the top, and below it in blue enamel letters set into the gold Department of Justice Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent. In the adjacent window, a photo ID, the driver looking exactly as he looked right now, composed patient, utterly unimpressed with the current situation. The name read Marcus Webb, Special Agent in Charge, Clearance Level Top Secret /SCI. Troy's stomach performed a slow, sickening drop the way a stomach does when the body understands something before the brain is willing to confirm it. He looked at the second wallet from the woman's bag. Another badge. Another ID. Deja Webb. Senior Prosecutor. U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The same last name. He looked up. Marcus Webb was standing by the back of the cruiser, cuffed, not looking at the ground. He was looking directly at Troy, and the expression on his face was not anger. Troy had been the object of anger his entire career and knew what it looked like. This was something entirely different. It was pity. The particular devastating pity of a person who has seen what you are going to become before you have. Riley, Troy said, and his voice came out wrong, too high, too thin. Yeah, Riley said, his eyes moving between Troy and the man in cuffs. Take them in. Troy's jaw tightened. He could not back down. Not here. Not in front of Briggs and Oakes and Riley. Not in front of the dash cams. It's a fake. A good fake, but a fake. Take them in. We'll verify at the station. Riley looked doubtful. Oakes made a sound that was not quite a word, but Riley followed orders. He put Marcus in the back of his cruiser. Briggs put Deja in the back of his. Troy stood on the shoulder of Route 9 alone, the badge in one hand and the gun in the other, and for one fast, terrible moment, he felt the architecture of 20 years begin to shift beneath him. He put both items in an evidence bag. He got in his cruiser. He drove. Behind him, 2 miles north, Agent Lena Reyes was already on a secure line to Birmingham. Troy arrived at the Pine Ridge Police Department 4 minutes before Marcus and Deja were brought in, and he used those 4 minutes the way a guilty man uses every available second, trying to build a version of events that he could live inside. He went to Sergeant Pete Murrow at the booking desk. Murrow was 52, thick through the middle, with the permanently tired expression of a man who had seen enough to know that most things ended badly and had made his peace with this. Big fish, Troy said, loud enough for the 2 officers in the bullpen to hear. Range Rover Atlanta plates, fake federal credentials, and I mean good ones, professional counterfeits. Concealed weapon under the seat. I need them processed separately. No phone calls until we verify their IDs through our own channels. Murrow took the toothpick out of his mouth. Troy, I know what you're going to say. Those badges real. They're fakes. Murrow looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has held his tongue for so many years that holding it has become a physical habit. He put the toothpick back. All right, he said. Your caller. The Sallyport door opened and Riley brought Marcus in, followed by Briggs with Deja. They walked the way people walk when they are not afraid of where they are going. Marcus with his head up and his shoulders easy. Deja with the unhurried precision of someone entering a room she had already mapped from the outside. Empty your pockets, Troy said. He reached for Marcus's arm to redirect him toward the counter. Marcus didn't move. Not resistance, just physics. The man was a wall. You have our wallets, Deja said. You have our phones. You have our credentials, which, by the way, Officer Harlan, you are legally required to verify immediately by calling the DOJ switchboard. Or Google. Whichever you find easier. I don't need your numbers, Troy said. He leaned toward her. I'm booking you as Jane Doe until you decide to be cooperative. My name, she said, enunciating each word with the careful patience of a woman who has spent her career speaking to people who needed to hear things exactly once, is Deja Webb. I am a senior prosecutor for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, and you are currently in violation of Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code Deprivation of Rights under color of law, which, as you will eventually discover, is a federal felony. Troy laughed. It came out rougher than he intended. You memorized the code number. Cute. He turned toward the room. Strip search. Both of them. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Deputy Oakes, who had been standing near the corner filing cabinet, looked up. No. Excuse me, I said no. She crossed her arms. Her voice was shaking, but she did not lower it. I am not strip-searching a woman in a blazer who just recited federal statute at you, Troy. I am not doing it. This is insubordination. Then write me up. She held his gaze. Her hands were gripping her own forearms hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Write me up. From the hallway. That's enough. Chief Raymond Dolby walked into the booking area. He was 58, heavy through the neck and jaw, with skin weathered by 60 Alabama summers into something approximating leather. He was not a good man. This was understood by everyone in the room, including himself, but he was a pragmatic one. He had survived 22 years as chief of Pine Ridge by cultivating an instinct for which situations could be managed and which had already escaped management. He picked up Marcus's badge from the counter. He held it in both hands. He ran his thumb across the eagle and the enamel lettering and the embedded security chip on the back. He had seen fake badges before they were light-stamped rather than cast with decal centerpieces that peeled at the edges. This badge had been made by the United States government, and it felt exactly like it. Dolby looked at Marcus Webb. Who are you? He said quietly, silly. Special Agent in Charge Marcus Webb, FBI Atlanta Field Office. And, Chief, if you do not remove these handcuffs in the next 60 seconds, I want you to understand that what happens next is going to happen to you, too. Dolby's jaw worked. He looked at Troy. Troy said, It's a fake Raymond. I'm telling you. Give him his phone, Dolby said. Chief, give him his phone. Murrow fished the phone from the evidence bag and set it on the counter. Marcus stepped forward, his cuffed hands in front of him, and picked it up. He unlocked it with his thumbprint and dialed a number from memory. He put the phone on speaker and set it on the booking counter. It rang twice. Director's office, a woman's voice answered. Crisp. Efficient. Patricia Marcus said this is Marcus Webb. Code Red. Pine Ridge, Alabama. Code Red. A pause of perhaps 1 second. When the voice returned, it had sharpened. Status of Agent Webb and Prosecutor Webb. We are secure but compromised. Local law enforcement intercepted us. I was held at gunpoint. Illegal search and seizure. Both of us were unlawfully detained and handcuffed. Our credentials were confiscated. Are you in immediate danger? Not immediate. But I need the team. Bring everyone. Full assets. ETA approximately 6 minutes. They've been holding at the perimeter. Tell them to come in. All the way in. Copy that. Hold tight, Marcus. The line clicked dead. Marcus looked at Troy Harlan. Troy had backed up against the filing cabinet, and all the color that Alabama heat had put in his face over 46 years had gone somewhere else. 6 minutes, Marcus said. I'd start thinking very carefully about what you want the next 6 minutes to look like. In the corner of the room, Deja had taken a small notebook from her jacket pocket and was writing. Rapidly, without looking up. Troy's voice, when it came, sounded like it was arriving from a long distance away. "What are you writing?" Deja did not look up. "Your indictment," she said. The 6 minutes that followed were the longest Troy Harlan had ever spent in the building he had worked in for 2 decades. He stood against the filing cabinet and watched Deputy Oakes walk to the other side of the room as deliberately as if she were crossing a border. Sergeant Murrow found something to examine on the surface of his desk. Deputy Briggs stood near the door with the expression of a 26-year-old who has just understood with horrible clarity that he has been on the wrong side of something. Only Riley remained near Troy, not out of loyalty, but because he did not know which direction to move. Deja continued writing in her notebook. Every few seconds she looked up, looked at Troy with a cool, professional assessment. Made a note, looked back down. She had the focused stillness of a surgeon making pre-operative observations. "What are you putting in there?" Troy asked. She did not look up this time. "The strip search request, sexual intimidation under color of law. That is a separate charge which adds approximately 5 years to federal sentencing guidelines. I did not touch you. You ordered it. 3 witnesses heard you. Officer Oakes has already indicated she will testify." She turned a page. "Keep talking if you like. Everything you say is being recorded." Troy's eyes went to the button on her lapel. He had not noticed it before. He stared at it for 3 seconds and felt something move through his body that was not quite fear and not quite understanding, but was exactly what happens in the space between them. "You set this up," he said. Deja finally looked up. Her eyes met his and held, and what was in them was not triumph. It was something more complete than that. It was the expression of someone who has worked toward a specific outcome for a long time and is now simply present for its arrival. "You set yourself up," she said. "We just drove the car." Troy took a step toward her. His hand went to the taser on his belt. "Troy." Dolby's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Do not." Troy's hand stopped. "Do not do one more thing," Dolby said. His voice had the quality of a man who has just understood the perimeter of his own catastrophe and is trying for the first time in his career to stay inside it. The mug of coffee on Murrow's desk began to tremble. Not from anyone's hand, from the floor. A low building vibration that started below the range of hearing and climbed steadily into the audible like the approach of something very large and very deliberate. Riley moved to the window. "Helicopter," he said. Then the sirens. Not one, but many. Coming from multiple directions, simultaneously converging on the Pine Ridge Police Department, the way weather converges on low ground. Murrow looked at Dolby. Dolby was looking at the wall. "Open the gate," Dolby said quietly. The Sallyport gate rolled up, and the afternoon light flooded in so suddenly and completely that everyone in the booking area shielded their eyes. The silhouettes appeared in the brightness like cutouts, 6 agents in full tactical gear, AR-15s at the ready. Moving in the fluid, practiced formation of people who have done this many times and have no interest in doing it dramatically. On their chests, Federal Bureau of Investigation in bold yellow letters. Behind them, 2 Alabama state troopers, and walking among them in a charcoal gray suit with a single strand of pearls at her collar, moving through the booking area of the Pine Ridge Police Department like she owned the property and all the land surrounding it, was Assistant Director Vivian Cross. Vivian Cross was 55 years old. She had short-cropped natural hair, reading glasses on a chain at her collar, and the particular bearing of a woman who had spent 30 years being the most qualified person in every room she entered, and had long ago stopped waiting for that to be acknowledged. She had grown up in Macon, Georgia, in a county with a single police department and 3 officers, one of whom had a reputation that her mother had explained to her before she started driving. She had been 17 before she understood that not every county was like hers. She had been 19 before she stopped being surprised that most people acted like they were. She surveyed the booking area with an expression that was comprehensive, unhurried, and missed nothing. She had seen the architecture of this kind of place before. She recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a symptom, not with surprise, but with the particular alertness of someone matching pattern to knowledge. "Hands," the lead tactical agent said. "Everyone." "Let me see hands." Every officer in the room raised their hands. Troy raised his too, which cost him something he would not have words for until much later. The team moved directly to Marcus and Deja. "Sir, ma'am. Are you injured?" "We are fine, Agent Porter." Marcus stood up, rolling his wrists as Oakes came forward and with steady hands removed the cuffs. "Situation is contained." Vivian Cross walked to Chief Dolby and stopped at a distance of approximately 18 inches. "Who is in command here?" she said. "I am." Dolby straightened. "Chief Raymond Dolby, Pine Ridge Police Department." "You are relieved," Cross said. "Effective this moment. The Alabama State Bureau of Investigation is assuming command of this facility. This building is now a federal crime scene." "On what grounds?" Dolby's voice was losing altitude with every word. "On the grounds that your department has been operating a systematic protection racket in coordination with a private law firm, resulting in the wrongful arrest, extortion, and civil rights violations of at least 47 residents of Mercer County over a period of 5 years. She looked at the badge number on his chest, then back at his face. "We have the financial records. We have the contractor invoices. We have 11 weeks of phone intercepts. And we have the ledger from Arthur Colton's safe, which was opened approximately 40 minutes ago." Dolby sat down in the nearest chair without being asked. Cross turned and looked at Troy Harlan for the first time. She examined him with the clinical recognition of something she had encountered in various forms throughout her career. He was the visible piece, the one the cameras would find, the face on the news cycle, the name that would become shorthand for a particular kind of failure. But she had learned long ago that the visible piece was never the whole problem. The whole problem was everything that had to be in place for a man like Troy to operate for 20 years. The dispatch sergeant who looked the other way, the chief whose name was on the shell company, the judge whose signed warrants sat in a drawer somewhere pre-filled, the lawyer whose billboard smiled down at the highway. A town that had learned by accumulated pressure and consequence that certain things were not worth reporting. She set those thoughts aside and did her job. "Is this the one?" she asked. "That is him," Deja said. She had stood up and was straightening her blazer. "Officer Troy Harlan." He initiated the stop without probable cause. He deployed racially targeted language during the stop. He conducted an unlawful search of both our persons and our vehicle. He removed a legal firearm from the vehicle and falsely classified it as illegal. He ordered an unlawful strip search in the presence of 3 witnesses. He brandished a taser against lawfully detained federal officers. She paused. "And he made a very specific statement about the Constitution and county lines that our recording equipment captured in excellent fidelity." Cross nodded once. She gestured toward the tactical team. 2 agents moved to Troy Harlan. They kicked his feet apart and pressed him against the wall and put zip cuffs on his wrists tight enough to mean something. It was performed with the professional efficiency of people who have done this to people who have done it to others. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Porter said. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law." "This is a mistake," Troy said. His voice had recovered some of its old texture. "I was doing my job. Those plates were from Atlanta. The windows were tinted." "That is enough," Cross said. Troy stopped. Marcus walked to Troy. He stopped at a comfortable distance. His voice was very quiet. "You wanted to find something in that car, Troy. You wanted to be the hero of the precinct tonight." He looked at him steadily. "You are going to be famous, just not in the way you planned." Troy said nothing. "Get him out," Cross said. As the agents moved Troy toward the Sallyport, Deja stood in the booking area and watched him go. She did not say anything. She had said everything she needed to say. She was thinking about a man who had gone quiet at county lines for 30 years, and she was thinking about a shoebox in a closet, and she was thinking about a note addressed to both of them that had waited in the dark for decades. She was thinking about how long some things take, and how when they finally arrive, they do not feel like victory so much as they feel like the correction of something that should never have needed correcting in the first place. Outside news vans were already pulling up. 3 local affiliates, a CNN crew, a reporter doing a live phone broadcast as she walked toward the department entrance. The door of the federal SUV closed. Once Troy was gone, the Pine Ridge Police Department became a different kind of place. Quieter, more serious. Agents moved through the bullpen collecting hard drives and filing cabinets. A technician photographed Troy's desk. 2 troopers sat with Dolby while a federal attorney explained his options. Marcus stood with Cross near the window, accounting for what had happened and what came next. Colton's ledger, Marcus said. Complete Cross confirmed. 47 documented cases. Names, dates, settlement amounts, disbursement records. Colton's account, Dolby's shell company, Harlan's account, 47. Sills. His practice has been generating falsified BAC reports for at least 6 years. We have the original instrument records from the county lab. They do not match Sills's official reports in 14 cases. Jerome Tate's is one of them. Marcus nodded. He looked south down Route 9. The Colton Law billboard was visible from the 2nd floor, Arthur Colton's silver-haired face composed and reassuring. "That comes down today," Marcus said. "Already called. County Public Works has a crew on the way." Deputy Oakes approached. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked like a person preparing to make a statement she had been practicing for a long time. "Agent Webb," she said. Marcus turned. "I knew things were wrong," she said. "I was not there for the Tate case. But the stops, the way Troy ran his patrols, the money that moved through the department in ways that did not make sense. I knew something was wrong, and I did not report it." She held his gaze. "I stopped Troy today on the search order. That is something. But it is not enough." Marcus produced a card. "Call this number tonight. Ask for Agent Reyes. Tell her everything you just told me and everything you have not said yet. If you are honest and complete, there is a path forward for you." Oakes took the card. Briggs came forward without being asked, holding a spiral notebook with both hands. He had been writing things down for 14 months because something in him had known that writing things down was the only protection available to someone in his position. He handed the notebook to Marcus and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Murrow did not approach. He sat at his desk with his hands folded and looked at nothing. He was not going to be charged, but the weight of everything he had not reported was sitting on him in a way that it had apparently not sat before, and Marcus suspected that the reckoning would continue long after today. Marcus dialed Calvin Reese. "Calvin, we have the ledger. Colton, Dolby, Harlan, Sills, all accounted for. I need you to bring Jerome Tate in." A pause. Then Calvin's voice rough and careful. "He is already here with me. Has been since 1 o'clock. He wanted to be near, but he did not know if it was going to work. Tell him it worked." Jerome Tate was 38 years old, and he walked into the Pine Ridge Police Department for the 2nd time in 14 months. And the difference between the 2 visits was the difference between a man being brought somewhere and a man choosing to go. He wore the same gray jacket he wore to church. He sat across from Marcus at the conference table and folded his hands and said, "Are you going to tell me what actually happened to me?" "I am," Marcus said. "And then, I need you to tell me everything you remember." Jerome told it in the flat, careful voice of a man who has lived inside a story long enough that the words have worn smooth grooves in his memory. His mother's birthday dinner, the baked chicken, the sweet potato pie made from scratch, his son Darius getting a 94 on his science test, all of them making a celebration of it. Leaving at 9:15 and driving Route 9 at 35 miles per hour because he was always careful on Route 9. The field sobriety test, passing it. The shift in Troy's expression that he had recognized even then, not relief, but the recalibration of someone managing an inconvenient result. The arrival of Dr. Sills in a personal car, the blood draw, the holding cell, his employer calling at 7 in the morning with a conversation that was very short. The worst part was not losing the job, Jerome said. His voice changed slightly, not breaking but thinning. It was my son. He looked at his hands. Darius was 12. He asked his mother first, and then he asked me, did I do it? Was I drinking? I told him no. I told the truth. And I could see on his face that he wanted to believe me, but there was a document from the state of Alabama that said something else, and he was 12, and he did not know how to weigh those two things. He was quiet for a moment. I had told him everything he was supposed to know about this country, how to behave if he got stopped. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Do not give anyone a reason to escalate. I did all of it. Every single thing I had told him to do, and it did not matter, and I did not know what to say to him about that. The conference room was very quiet. Deja set down her pen. Calvin looked at the floor. Marcus said, Jerome. The blood test result filed by Dr. Sills does not match the original instrument data from the county lab. Your actual blood alcohol content was 0.00. You were completely sober. The conviction was fabricated, every element of it manufactured by Harlan in coordination with Sills and Colton, with Dolby's knowledge and facilitation. Jerome held very still. What does that mean? He asked carefully. It means your case is being formally reviewed by the DOJ and the conviction will be vacated. It means Harlan and Colton and Dolby and Sills are all going to federal prison. It means the state of Alabama has to account for what was done to you. Marcus paused. And it means you can tell your son the truth and show him the official document that confirms it. Jerome's folded hands pressed together until the knuckles whitened. He breathed. How long have you known? He asked. We have been building the case for 11 months. 11 months, Jerome said. He did not say what he was thinking, that 11 months was a long time to know something was wrong and let a man continue living under its weight. He understood the necessity of it. He understood the warrants and the witnesses and the financial records and all the careful work that 11 months contained. He understood all of it. Understanding did not eliminate the weight of the 11 months. It just gave the weight a name. He looked at Marcus, at Deja, at Calvin, who had driven to Birmingham and sat in a federal office and told his story to a stranger because someone had to, and he had decided that someone was him. Jerome unfolded his hands. Okay, he said. What do you need from me? Deja picked up her pen. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and do not leave anything out. While Jerome talked and Deja wrote, Marcus walked to the window. South down Route 9, the Colton Law billboard was visible. Arthur Colton's silver-haired face, the promise that someone would fight for you. A county public works truck had pulled up beneath it. Two men in hard hats were measuring the structure, calculating the approach. By the time Jerome finished talking, the billboard was gone. The sky above the empty lot was just sky. Troy spent 3 hours in a federal holding room before Gary Pruitt arrived. Pruitt was a Birmingham criminal defense attorney who had driven down at emergency rates and who walked through the door looking like a man who had read the evidence disclosure and was now managing the gap between what his client expected him to do and what was actually possible. Troy had used the 3 hours to think. The playbook was clear to him. He had watched it deployed 100 times from the other side of the table. Minimal cooperation. Invoke the union. Wait for Dolby to mobilize department support. The problem was that every pillar of the playbook was gone. Dolby was in a separate room. The union rep was unavailable, a word that meant the union had calculated its exposure and decided Troy was too radioactive to touch. And Colton had apparently been cooperating for 3 months, which explained the surgical precision of everything that had happened today. He thought about the button on Deja's lapel, about the wallet he had thrown on the hood without opening, because opening it would have required acknowledging something he was not prepared to acknowledge. About the way Marcus had looked at him in the booking room, not with satisfaction, not with contempt, but with the clear diagnostic attention of someone who has watched the same story complete itself many times. When Pruitt sat down and said, "Troy, I need to be honest about what we are facing." Troy did not argue. He looked at his hands on the table and he let his lawyer talk. Then he said, "Is there anything I can do for myself?" Pruitt looked at him carefully. "Possibly. Depends on what you are willing to give them." Meaning what? Meaning there are other counties, other arrangements like yours. The federal investigation has identified at least 6 similar structures in other Alabama municipalities. They have the pattern. What they lack are the specific names, account structures, and internal mechanics. Pruitt paused. You have been around long enough to have that information. Troy was quiet for a long time. "What does it get me?" he said. "Reduction from 22 to somewhere between 12 and 15 depending on the completeness and verifiability of what you provide. Facility transfer to somewhere with appropriate separation for cooperative witnesses." Troy looked at the walls, at the fluorescent light, at the metal door. He thought about D-Block, which he had not yet experienced, but which he understood was waiting for him. Then, for the first time in the conversation, he stopped thinking about himself. He thought about Jerome Tate's hands folded on the conference table, about the 12-year-old boy who had been handed a document from the state and had not known how to weigh it against his father's word, about 47 people who had calculated correctly that complaining would not be worth what it cost them and had made that calculation because of him. He had not in 20 years spent much time thinking about them as 47 separate people. He had thought of them as a category, as a pattern, as his road tax paying for itself. They were becoming something else now, specifically individually real. And that realness was new and uncomfortable and completely without remedy. "I need to think," he said. "Think fast," Pruitt said. "The window does not stay open long." That evening, Troy Harlan picked up the phone in the holding room and placed a call to Arthur Colton's secondary attorney, a man named Frank Dreyer, who handled the overflow cases and the informal conversations that Colton preferred not to conduct under his own name. Troy did not know that the holding room phone was monitored. He had known in the abstract that holding room phones were monitored. He had simply not translated that knowledge into the understanding that his phone calls in his current situation were being recorded in real time by the same federal apparatus that had spent 11 weeks building the case against him. He told Dreyer, "Tell Arthur to hold tight. They have the surface of it. They don't have the whole network. If Arthur gives me up completely, the whole thing unravels for everyone, including Frank's clients in Jefferson and Calhoun." He hung up. At 9:17 p.m., Agent Reyes transcribed the call and forwarded it to U.S. Attorney David Park with a single sentence of annotation, "Obstruction of justice conspiracy." Add it. The window Troy had been told not to miss was by 9:17 p.m. closed. The morning after Troy Harlan's arrest, Pine Ridge woke up to something it had not experienced in 20 years, the sensation of its own machinery grinding to a halt. It began before sunrise. By 5:47 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs and unmarked federal vans had positioned themselves at 3 points in Mercer County, and at exactly 6 a.m., they moved simultaneously because that was how these things worked when you had 11 weeks of surveillance and a federal magistrate's signatures on 8 separate warrants. Target 1 was Arthur Colton's office on Main Street, the converted Victorian with the bay windows and the tasteful brass plaque. The raid team arrived as a paralegal was unlocking the front door for the day. Inside, behind a bookcase that swung outward on a pneumatic hinge, they found a Mosler safe containing a physical ledger that matched almost line for line the electronic records they had already recovered. They also found $88,000 in cash divided into brown envelopes by date and a handwritten note on Colton's personal stationery that, when read alongside the ledger, constituted the most efficient confession in the history of Mercer County. Colton himself was found at the Pine Ridge Country Club, preparing to tee off at the 7th hole. Salmon-colored pants, white polo, a cup of coffee in his hand. When Agent Reyes approached him across the fairway and said his name, he set the coffee cup down very carefully on the ground, as if leaving it for someone to find later, and he said, "I know. I've been expecting you." He had been cooperating for 3 months. He had spent those months continuing to go to work and act normal and play golf on Tuesday mornings while feeding financial records and phone records and meeting notes to Agent Reyes through a dead-drop arrangement that would have seemed implausible if it weren't thoroughly documented. He had done this not out of civic conscience, but out of the calculation that the first person to cooperate received the best terms. Arthur Colton had always been very good at terms. Target 2 was Judge Preston Waverly's residence, a colonial on 4 acres at the edge of town. Waverly had apparently received some advance signal, perhaps a phone call from someone in the department, because when agents arrived at 6:15 a.m. they found a paper shredder running in his home office, and Waverly in a bathrobe feeding documents into it with the frantic speed of a man who has miscalculated how much time he has. He had miscalculated significantly. The shredder contained partially destroyed warrant applications, blank forms with Waverly's pre-signed signature at the bottom, which Troy had apparently been filling in at his convenience for 4 years. Waverly was handcuffed on his own front lawn, while 3 news helicopters tipped off by the FBI's press office in a decision that was simultaneously ethically questionable and entirely deliberate, captured the image live. A federal judge in a silk robe handcuffed on manicured grass at 6:15 in the morning. The photograph appeared on every front page in the state by noon. Target 3 was City Hall, where Mayor Curtis Fenn was in the middle of a 7:30 a.m. press conference he had called the previous evening before the arrests began, in which he planned to get ahead of the story by expressing confidence in the department and the strong implication that he had known nothing about anything. He was at the podium adjusting his reading glasses and preparing to deliver his opening statement when the double doors at the back of the room opened. Marcus Webb walked in, FBI credentials on a chain around his neck, a sealed federal warrant in his right hand. He walked to the front of the room through a crowd of reporters and cameras with the unhurried directness of a man who has been in this building longer than the man at the podium. He stopped at the foot of the steps leading to the dais. "Mayor Fenn," he said, and his voice carried in the room without effort. "Federal warrant," Fenn said. "You can't do this here. We have the contractor invoices," Marcus said. He was not performing. He was simply reciting facts. "We have the transfers from Colton's LLC to the account registered to Lakeside Property Solutions, which is your account. We have 36 months of payment records. We have your signature on 3 separate agreements that authorized Dolby to expand the traffic enforcement program that generated the revenue for those payments." He paused. "It's over, Mayor." Deja stepped up beside Fenn and produced handcuffs, and the cameras that had been trained on the press conference were now producing something considerably more newsworthy. The flash of the cuffs, the expression on Fenn's face, a compound of disbelief and shame, and the particular blankness of a man watching his long-held certainty evaporate appeared in newspapers across the country by the following morning. By noon, the towing company owner who had split impound fees with the department had surrendered voluntarily. Dr. Raymond Sills, whose falsified BAC reports had been the clinical foundation of the whole operation, was arrested at his practice at 10:15 a.m. Deputy Briggs had spent the night composing a written statement of everything he had observed in 14 months and surrendered it along with his badge and his spiral notebook at 8 a.m. He was granted cooperation status. By 2 p.m., the power structure of Pine Ridge, which had been building itself quietly for 20 years, had been disassembled in 8 hours, And then, in the afternoon of that same day, the people of Pine Ridge began in the tentative and uncertain way that communities begin things they have been afraid to begin to talk to each other about what they had seen. Not in dramatic fashion, not in town squares or on the steps of City Hall. In the way that actual community conversation happens in the parking lot of the grocery store, in the waiting room of Calvin Reese's garage, over the counter of the pharmacy on Clement Street. A woman named Cheryl Morse, who ran the diner on Main Street and had watched Troy Harlan eat breakfast there 3 mornings a week for 15 years, told her daughter that morning that she had once seen Troy take $100 out of a wallet while the owner sat in the back of his cruiser. She had told no one at the time. She told her daughter now because the thing had been sitting inside her for 4 years and the weight of it had become specific, and she needed to put it somewhere outside herself. Her daughter said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Cheryl said. "To who?" The question stood in the kitchen of the diner for a long moment with no answer, because the answer was obvious, and the obviousness of it was the whole problem, and had been for 20 years. By afternoon, a federal victim services coordinator named Angela Park had set up a temporary office in the conference room of the Pine Ridge Public Library. She was there to take statements from anyone who had been stopped, extorted, harassed, or otherwise harmed by the operation that Harlan Colton Dolby and their associates had been running. She had a sign on the door. She had water on a side table. She sat at the table with a legal pad and a recorder, and she waited. The first person through the door arrived 7 minutes after she opened. A retired school teacher, 61 years old, who had been stopped by Troy on Route 9 5 years ago and had paid $200 to avoid being charged with obstruction. He had never told his wife. By 4 o'clock, the sign-in sheet had 31 names. By the end of the week, it had 68. Not all of them were extortion cases. Some were stops that had cost nothing financially, but had cost something else. The accumulated erosion of a person's sense of safety in their own town, of their right to move through their own community without performing a specific kind of careful invisibility. That cost did not have a dollar figure. Angela Park wrote it down anyway because it had happened, and what happened deserved to be recorded. 4 months after the arrests on a Thursday in December, the federal courthouse in Birmingham was full. The building was a different category of institution from the Pine Ridge Police Department. Marble floors, high ceilings, the weight of federal authority pressed into every surface. The air conditioning ran cold enough to be noticeable, and in courtroom 4B, every seat in the gallery had been taken by 9 o'clock in the morning. Jerome Tate sat in the 3rd row. He had driven up from Pine Ridge alone, leaving before dawn, and he had found a seat and folded his hands in his lap, and he had not moved when people filled in around him. He had told no one he was coming. This was something he needed to do privately, bear witness to the mechanics of what had been done to him, watch the system account for itself. He was wearing the gray jacket. He intended to be here for every proceeding, every hearing, every session. He had decided this the night after Marcus told him what Sills had done. He had sat in his apartment on Clement Street above the hardware store and had made a list of the things he could still control, and this was one of them, his presence, his witness. The fact that the man who had done this to him would not be able to look at the front of a courtroom without Jerome Tate being somewhere in his field of vision. Troy Harlan was brought in through a side door. He had lost 22 pounds in 4 months. The orange jumpsuit was too large, which made him look like a man being gradually absorbed by his own consequences. He had the kind of pallor that comes from months of fluorescent lighting and no good sleep, and the swagger that had been the signature of his physical presence. The particular weight of a man who believes he owns the room was simply gone. He sat down without looking at the gallery. His court-appointed public defender, Gary Pruitt, was a tired-looking man in his early 50s who opened his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who has learned not to get emotionally attached to outcomes. He was arguing today that the dashcam footage and audio recordings should be suppressed, that the federal surveillance operation constituted entrapment, that the recording from Deja's lapel violated Troy's reasonable expectation of privacy, that the entire stop had been manufactured to destroy an innocent officer. Judge Evelyn Marsh, known in Birmingham's legal community as the Scalpel for her precise, unsentimental dismantling of arguments, reviewed Pruitt's motions over her reading glasses with an expression that communicated she had read them and found them wanting, and was now managing the administrative necessity of letting the process play out. Deja was at the government's table assisting U.S. Attorney David Park. When Park stood to address the court, he presented the metadata from the dashcam SD card independently verified by the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit, no alterations, no gaps, the original unedited recording. He presented the federal wiretap warrant signed by Magistrate Judge Oates 11 weeks before the stop. He presented the lapel recording Deja had been a federal agent conducting an authorized undercover operation, and the recording was entirely legal. Then he called his surprise witness. Arthur Colton entered the courtroom through the main doors, and the murmur that moved through the gallery was the particular sound of people revising their understanding of a situation. Colton looked smaller than he had on his billboard, diminished the silver-haired confidence contracted to something more precisely proportioned to who he actually was. He walked to the stand without looking at the defense table. He was sworn in. Under Park's methodical questioning, Colton described the origin of the scheme in detail that made the gallery go very quiet. It had been Troy's idea, not the original extortion which Troy had been running independently for years, but the formalization of the arrangement, the integration with Colton's practice, the systematic targeting. Troy had approached Colton after watching him win a large settlement from the city on behalf of a client who had been roughed up during an arrest. Troy had seen the size of the check and had proposed a partnership. And did Officer Harlan express preferences about who he would target? Park asked. Colton looked at his hands, then at the jury box. Though there was no jury present today, this was a suppression hearing before the judge. Old courtroom habits. He maintained a list, Colton said. Vehicle types, window tint, darkness, estimated market value. He had target parameters. Colton paused, and he expressed a consistent preference for black drivers. He said, and I'm quoting from memory, that they were, quote, easier to manage, and that the juries in Mercer County wouldn't take their word over his. Across our cases, 92% of the targeted drivers were black. The gallery didn't erupt. The courtroom's atmosphere was too formally controlled for that, but the sound that moved through it was dense and collective. A breath drawn and held. In the third row, Jerome Tate sat very still. He had known. Of course, he had known with the kind of knowledge that doesn't require evidence because it lives in the body, in the hands that go to the wheel, when the lights come on, in the voice that goes careful and flat and precise because the margin for being misread is so thin. He had known what had been done to him and why. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it confirmed formally in a federal courtroom in Birmingham by the man who designed the system that swallowed you. 92%. That number was not an abstraction. That number was every family in Pine Ridge who had driven Route 9 holding their breath. Jerome looked at his hands. Then he looked up at the front of the room. Troy Harlan at the defense table was staring at the surface of the wood. Judge Marsh looked over her glasses at the defense table for a long moment after Colton stepped down. Then she said, "Mr. Pruitt, I have reviewed your motions thoroughly. The motion to suppress is denied. The recordings are admissible. The federal authorization for the surveillance operation was valid, complete, and executed properly. The evidence stands." She removed her glasses. And frankly, counselor, if I were advising your client, I would suggest he think very seriously about a plea agreement, because what I have seen today suggests that a jury is going to have a very uncomplicated time reaching a verdict. She set her glasses on the bench. She looked at Troy Harlan directly, which was something she did rarely. "We'll take a brief recess," she said, And the gavel came down. In the third row, Jerome Tate unclenched his hands. The trial itself lasted 4 days, which felt both longer and shorter than it was longer because of the accumulating weight of testimony, shorter because the outcome had been structurally determined before the jury was seated. On the third day, the prosecution called Jerome Tate. He walked from the gallery to the witness stand with the attention of the entire courtroom. He was wearing the gray jacket again. He had gotten a haircut. He sat in the witness chair and adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room with eyes that were steady and a little tired and very much awake. U.S. Attorney Park began with the procedural facts, the date, the location, the stop, the field sobriety test, the arrival of Dr. Sills. Jerome answered each question in a voice that was even and clear and careful, in the way of someone who has decided in advance not to perform emotion for anyone else's benefit. Then Park asked Mr. Tate, "Can you tell the jury what the night of the stop had been like for you before?" Officer Harlan pulled you over. Jerome looked at the jury. There were 12 of them, 8 women, 4 men varying ages, the composition that a federal jury selection produces. They were looking at him the way people look when they have committed to listening. "My mother's birthday," he said. "I'd been at her house in Millhaven. She made her sweet potato pie. She makes it from scratch, takes her all afternoon. My sister was there, my brother-in-law, my kids. Darius had just gotten a 94 on his science test, and we all made a big deal of it because that kid works hard." He paused. "It was a good night. I kissed my mother goodbye and I drove home at 35 miles an hour, because I always drive that way on Route 9. He described the stop. He described the field sobriety test and the moment he passed it, and saw the shift in Troy's expression, not relief, not professional satisfaction, but the recalibration of someone who had expected a different result and was now planning around the inconvenience of accuracy. He described Dr. Sills arriving in a personal car. He described the blood draw and the waiting and the processing and the holding cell. "Were you afraid?" Park asked. "I was terrified," Jerome said, "but I kept it inside because I knew I had always known the way we all know in that community, that if I showed fear, it would be used as a reason to do more to me. And if I showed anger, it would definitely be used as a reason to do more to me. So I kept it inside, and I answered every question they asked me, and I did everything they told me to do, and they charged me anyway." He talked about the phone call from his employer, about the CDL, about the conversation with his wife Tanya, who had held on as long as she could and then had reached the limits of what holding on cost her, about the apartment on Clement Street that smelled like old carpet and was directly above a hardware store whose delivery trucks arrived at 5:30 every morning, about the 3 jobs and the $19,000 a year and what $19,000 a year looks like when you have 2 children who deserve better than what you can give them on $19,000 a year. And then Park asked Mr. Tate, "You mentioned your son Darius. Can you tell the jury about that?" Jerome was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was so still that the hum of the air handling system was audible. "Darius was 12 when this happened," he said. "He's 14 now. He's going to be 15 in February." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at the jury. "When you're a father and you're raising a black son in this country, there are conversations you have that you wish you didn't have to have. You have them anyway because if you don't, the world has them instead, and the world is not a good teacher. I had told Darius all the things I was supposed to tell him, how to behave if he ever got stopped, how to keep his hands visible, how to speak clearly and stay calm and not give anyone a reason to escalate." He paused. "I did everything I had told my son to do, and I still ended up charged." A juror in the second row, a woman in her 50s, pressed her lips together. "After I was charged," Jerome continued, "Darius asked me if I had done it, if I had been drinking. And I told him no. I told him the truth. And I could see that he wanted to believe me, but he was 12, and there was a document from the state that said something different, and he didn't know how to weigh those two things against each other. Jerome's voice thinned slightly, not breaking, but approaching something close to it. I didn't have an answer for him. What do you say the system is wrong? He already knew the system could be wrong. That wasn't news. The news was that his father hadn't been able to stop it from happening to him. The news was that everything I had taught him, every rule, every instruction, every piece of guidance I had given him about how to be safe had not been enough. And I didn't know what to do with my face when he looked at me. He stopped. Park said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Tate. No further questions." The cross-examination by Pruitt was brief and largely unsuccessful. He asked Jerome whether he had been speeding, no. Whether he had consumed any alcohol at all, no. Whether he had spoken with federal agents prior to today's testimony, yes, when his case was reopened 4 months ago. Whether he had been coached on his answers, a pause, a look at Pruitt, and then, "No one coached me. I've been thinking about this testimony for 14 months. I've had a lot of time to prepare." When Pruitt sat down, Jerome looked toward the gallery. Troy Harlan at the defense table was looking at his hands. As Jerome stepped down and walked back through the gallery, he passed the defense table at a distance of perhaps 6 feet. He did not look at Troy Harlan. He looked straight ahead through the double doors into the marble corridor beyond. Troy watched him go. Something passed across Troy's face that his attorney sitting beside him would later describe when asked for his observations as, like he saw something for the first time. Like the room got bigger all of a sudden, and he was smaller in it. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes, which in a federal corruption case of this complexity was essentially immediate. When they filed back in, none of them looked at the defense table. This is the thing that experienced courtroom observers always note: the direction of a jury's gaze when they return says everything about what they have decided before the verdict is read, before the forewoman opens her mouth. Troy Harlan knew this too. He had testified in enough jury trials to know what it meant when 12 people returned from deliberation and found the ceiling, the floor, the prosecution table, anything except the person they had been asked to judge. He sat very still. The forewoman, a retired schoolteacher from Hoover, the kind of woman who spent her career in rooms full of people who tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior and had developed a comprehensive and impatient understanding of what truth looked like, stood and read the verdict. Guilty. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty. Conspiracy to commit extortion. Guilty. Filing false official reports. Guilty. Assault on a federal officer. Guilty. Racketeering. 5 counts. 5 times the word landed in the courtroom and settled into the permanent record of a federal court. In the gallery, Calvin Reese closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them. He was sitting next to a woman he had met in the courthouse lobby that morning, Mrs. Dorothy Tate Jerome's mother. She had driven up from Mill Haven before even Jerome had. She was 71 years old and she was wearing a purple church hat, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was not passive, but gathered the stillness of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and has just been told she can set it down. She reached over and put her hand briefly over Calvin's. She didn't say anything. Marcus sat in the back row. He had not occupied a prominent seat. This was not his moment to occupy. He watched the verdict being delivered with the particular quality of attention of someone who understands that outcomes like this are not endings but corrections, and that corrections, while necessary, come at a cost that the system never fully accounts for. Deja was at the government's table. When the last count was read, she made a note on her legal pad, a single line which no one near her could see. She capped her pen and set it down. Troy said in the quiet after the verdict, "I'll appeal." Pruitt put a hand briefly on his arm. The hand said everything necessary. It was the hand of a man communicating with practiced gentleness that an appeal was going to be technically possible but procedurally futile, and that the resources for pursuing it were going to become a significant question given the forfeiture of assets that the federal sentencing guidelines were about to impose. Judge Marsh set sentencing for 2 weeks hence. The gavel came down. As the gallery filed out and the marshals prepared to return Troy to federal custody, he stood from the defense table and turned toward the room. It was the kind of involuntary movement that people make when the body hasn't yet received the message that there is nowhere to go, the instinct to face the room, to occupy it, to take up the space that has always been available to a man like him. He looked at the gallery, he looked at Calvin Reese, he looked at Dorothy Tate in the purple hat. He looked at Jerome, who was standing near the doors with his jacket on and his posture straight, already preparing to leave, already not making this moment about the man who had unmade his life. Jerome did not give Troy the satisfaction of eye contact. Troy looked at the back of Jerome's head as he walked through the door. And then there was nothing left to look at. 2 weeks later, the courtroom held a different quality of silence. The trial's silence had been taut with uncertainty, the compressed anticipation of an outcome that was coming but had not yet arrived. This silence was heavier and more final. The outcome had arrived. What remained was its formal application, the translation of verdict into consequence, the moment where the American legal system does the thing it does best and worst simultaneously. It names what something costs. Judge Evelyn Marsh entered at 9 a.m. precisely. She had a stack of documents at her left hand and her reading glasses at the end of her nose, and she looked as she always looked, like a person who has organized her understanding of the situation completely and is ready to deliver it. Before the formal sentencing, 2 victim impact statements had been submitted to the court. One was from a man named Eddie Garrett, 32 years old, a delivery driver from Montgomery, who had lost $240 and a day's work and a measure of dignity at the hands of Troy Harlan 6 years ago, and had never complained to anyone because he had calculated correctly that complaining would not be worth what it cost him. His statement was 4 paragraphs, and it was not dramatic. It was just honest, which was worse. The second was from Jerome Tate. Jerome had asked to read his in person. He stood at the podium in the gray jacket, and he looked at the judge and he said, "I don't want to talk about Officer Harlan today. I've thought about him enough. I want to talk about my son Darius, who is 14 years old and who has been waiting for 2 years to understand what happened to his father." He paused. "What I want Darius to know, what I want this court to have on the record, is that the system failed us, completely. But then it also eventually didn't. And I want him to understand both of those things at the same time, because he's going to live in this country for the rest of his life, and he needs to understand the whole thing, not just the part that hurts, and not just the part that fixed it." He looked at his hands briefly. "I want him to understand that there were people who spent 11 months doing this right slowly, carefully, completely, so that when it was done, it was done. Not just for me, for all 47 of us." He raised his head. "That's what I have to say." He sat down. Troy Harlan was then asked if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Troy stood. He had prepared something 4 paragraphs about his 20 years on the force, about the choices that law enforcement officers face, about the complexity of working in a small town where the lines between institutional authority and personal behavior blur over time. It was not an apology exactly. It was a negotiation. One last attempt to reframe the narrative in terms that might produce a modulated response. He had gotten to the second sentence when Judge Marsh said, "Officer Harlan." He stopped. "I've reviewed the evidence in this case more thoroughly than I have reviewed evidence in any case in my 23 years on this bench," she said. "I've read every stop report, every arrest record, every financial transfer, every text message and phone call from 11 weeks of federal surveillance." She put her glasses down on the bench. "What I find when I look at this record is not complexity. What I find is a man who decided early in his career that the power given to him for the protection of his community would instead be used for the extraction of wealth and the maintenance of a private hierarchy, and who then spent 20 years finding increasingly efficient ways to continue doing that. Troy lowered his piece of paper. 20 years is not a mitigating circumstance, Mr. Harlan. 20 years is the dimension of the harm. She picked up the sentencing guidelines. On the federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit extortion, filing false official reports, assault on a federal officer, racketeering, and the additional charge of obstruction of justice. The phone call you placed from the federal holding room on the evening of your arrest in which you attempted to coordinate a cover-up with the network of which you were a part. I sentence you to 22 years in a federal correctional institution to be served without the possibility of parole. Your law enforcement pension is hereby forfeited in its entirety. You are further ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $287,000 to the identified victims of your extortion scheme to be administered by the court. She picked up her gavel. Furthermore, your law enforcement credentials are permanently revoked. You will never serve in any law enforcement capacity in the United States of America. The gavel came down. As the federal marshals moved toward the defense table, Troy stood. Old habit, he had always stood when authority required it. He stood, and he turned toward the gallery, and this time the turn was not the instinct to occupy a room. It was something else, something that even he could not have named precisely. He looked at the gallery, at Calvin Reese, at Dorothy Tate in the purple hat, at Jerome who was standing near the aisle, his jacket on, ready to leave. This time, Jerome looked back. They held each other's gaze for perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, everything that needed to be said between them, all the accumulated wrong and the long wait and the final accounting moved across the space between them without any of it requiring language. Then, Jerome looked away. Not down, not in defeat. He simply turned his head toward the door the way a person turns toward a road they are about to take. He had a drive back to Pine Ridge. He had 2 boys to call. He had a life that needed attending to, and the man at the defense table had now officially become part of its past. The marshals put the cuffs on Troy. The metallic click of them carried in the quiet room. Troy Harlan looked at the floor. Marcus sat in the back row and watched the way Troy moved when they brought him in that morning. He had been watching people's bodies in courtrooms for 22 years, and he had learned that the body tells the truth before the face does, before the words do. Troy moved like a man who had lost something structural. Not the swagger, which was obvious. The swagger was a performance and performance's end. Something more basic. He moved like a man who had lost his certainty about the dimensions of the room, about where the walls were and how far the floor could be trusted. He had spent 20 years in rooms where he determined the boundaries of things. He no longer knew how to move through a room that was organized by someone else's rules. He thought about something Deja had said the night before over dinner in their hotel room. She had said, "Do you ever wonder what we would have been if we had been raised in a town like Pine Ridge, and things had gone differently for us? If someone had decided early on that we were the kind of people who could be used?" He had thought about it. He had said, "I think the difference was never about us. It was about what the town decided to let happen." She had nodded. That's what makes it systemic. Not one person. A whole structure of decisions made by whole groups of people over many years. Troy is the most visible one, but he could not have lasted 20 years if 20 years of people had not decided it was easier to let him. He had thought about that for a long time after she fell asleep. He thought about Jerome Tate reading his statement. "I want Darius to understand that the system failed us completely." But then, it also eventually did not. Both things were true simultaneously, and they did not cancel each other out. That was the thing that took the longest to hold properly. In your head, the failure and the correction both existed in the same story, and the story was not over, and the next town was already waiting. The Federal Correctional Institution in Talladega was not what Troy had allowed himself to imagine during the weeks of pre-trial detention. He had, in the optimistic corners of a mind still partly governed by the self-serving logic of 20 years, imagined something manageable, a place with structure and routines where his former law enforcement status might carry some residual weight. It did not carry weight. It was the weight. Processing was methodical and impersonal in the way that only institutions can be: the confiscation of clothing, the administrative shower, the medical examination, the issuance of a uniform that smelled like industrial detergent, and another man's tenure. The number assigned to him was 71203-008. His name for the purposes of the institution was that number. Everything else he had been for 46 years was not applicable here. The officer who processed him was a young black man no older than Briggs had been back in Pine Ridge. He worked through the intake checklist without expression. When he came to the name field and read it back, he said, "I know who you are," in a tone of voice that communicated nothing except that this was true. "I need protective custody," Troy said. "I'm former law enforcement. There's a separation protocol." "Protective custody is at capacity," the officer said. He didn't look up. "You're assigned to D block. There has to be a D block." He stamped a form and moved to the next item. D block was a multi-tiered concrete cavern where sound bounced off every surface and accumulated into a continuous ambient roar. Troy walked the tier behind a corrections officer, and he made the mistake that first-time inmates always make. He looked up. He met eyes. Eyes that had nothing in them except recognition not of Troy Harlan specifically, but of the category of thing he represented. The tier knew about him, the way tiers always know, through a communications network that operates faster and more reliably than anything the institution officially provides. He reached his cell, 6 by 8, 2 bunks, a metal desk bolted to the wall. A fluorescent light that buzzed at a frequency specifically calibrated, it seemed to prevent rest. His cellmate was a large man in his mid-40s doing push-ups on the floor. He stopped when Troy came in. He stood up. He looked at Troy the way you look at something that has arrived in your space that you neither wanted nor can immediately remove. He said, "You the cop?" Former Troy said. The man turned back to the wall and lay down on his bunk and pulled a paperback book over his face without saying anything else. This was worse than hostility. Hostility had texture. This was erasure. That first night the lights went out at 10 o'clock, and the block continued to be loud voices, footsteps, the distant clang of metal on metal in the way that institutions are loud even in darkness. Troy lay on his back on the thin mattress and looked at a ceiling he couldn't see, and let his mind run where it always went, when all other options were closed. The Range Rover, the shape of it in the heat, the way the sun bounced off the hood when Marcus and Deja stepped out onto the shoulder. He kept returning to Deja's face when she had taken off her sunglasses and looked at him across the top of the car, that specific quality of stillness which he had read at the time as submission and which he now understood had been something else entirely. It had been the expression of a person who has already done the hard work and is now present for the conclusion. He thought about the wallet on the hood. He had thrown it there without opening it, because opening it would have meant acknowledging the possibility that the people he had stopped were exactly who they said they were, and that acknowledgement was one he had trained himself out of 20 years ago. He thought about Jerome Tate's face in the courtroom, the gray jacket, the hands folded on the table, the way Jerome had said, "I didn't know what to do with my face," and the whole room had gone very quiet. What would Troy have done with his face if the situation had been reversed? He didn't know. He had never had to think about that question, and that the lifelong exemption from that question was perhaps the exact center of everything that had gone wrong. Somewhere on the tier a voice called out through the dark, "Hey, Officer Harlan. Pull me over." Laughter. The sound of it moving down the corridor and coming back changed the way sound does in concrete spaces. Troy closed his eyes. 3 weeks after processing, Troy was called to the visitation room. He walked in expecting Pruitt. The appeal had been filed as promised and was proceeding through its procedurally inevitable course toward its procedurally inevitable conclusion. Marcus Webb was sitting at the metal table. He was not in federal agent attire. He wore a blue Oxford shirt open at the collar and a jacket, and he looked, Troy thought, sitting down across from him like a man who was comfortable enough in his own identity that he didn't need the external markers of it. He looked like he slept well. He looked at Troy with the clear diagnostic attention of someone examining a situation that has reached its natural outcome. "Why are you here?" Troy asked. "I made you a promise," Marcus said. "In the booking room, I told you that what happened next was going to happen. I like to follow up. That wasn't a promise, that was a threat. I suppose it was both." Marcus rested his hands on the table. "There's also a practical reason. We have a proposal from the Department of Justice." He slid a single folded document across the table. Troy looked at it without touching it. "Sentence reduction. Potentially, depending on the completeness and verifiability of the information provided." "What information?" "The network doesn't end at Pine Ridge," Marcus said. "You know that. The arrangements you had with Colton, the structural model of how it worked, exists in at least 6 other municipalities that we've identified, and probably more that we haven't. You were part of a regional ecosystem, Troy. You had phone conversations, money transfers, in-person meetings." He paused. "We want the names, the account structures, the judge and the chiefs and the lawyers, the whole thing." Troy picked up the document. He unfolded it. He read it. The numbers were real. A reduction from 22 years to 14 contingent on cooperation that could be independently verified. Movement to a facility with better separation protocols. He set the document down. "If I talk," he said, "I become a target in here. You know that. The protocol for cooperative witnesses includes facility transfer and appropriate housing." "Appropriate. That's a word that covers a lot of ground." "Yes," Marcus said. "It does." Troy looked at the man across from him. He had hated him in the first weeks of custody, had spent hours in his bunk organizing his anger toward Marcus Webb into something structured and satisfying. But anger in this environment was expensive. It used the kind of energy that wasn't renewable under fluorescent lights and institutional food and the constant ambient noise of D-Block. What he felt now was something more complicated than hatred and less comfortable than resignation. It was the beginning of a reckoning with the specific nature of what he had done, not the legal definition of it, but the human texture of it. Jerome Tate's hands on the table, Dorothy Tate in the purple hat, Eddie Garrett's 4 paragraphs, the 68 names on Angela Park's sign-in sheet at the Pine Ridge Library, each one a person who had calculated correctly that complaining would not be worth what it cost them. 47 cases, 47 versions of that weight. He had not until very recently thought of them as 47 separate people. They were becoming real now. In small increments in the dark of D-Block at 10 o'clock at night, they were becoming specific and individually real. "You ruined my life," Troy said. It came out less forceful than he'd intended, more like an observation than an accusation. "No," Marcus said. "You were running your life in a particular direction for 20 years. I just turned on the lights." He leaned forward slightly. "The people in those 47 cases, their lives were affected by choices you made. Their kids asked the same questions Darius Tate asked. Their families had the same conversations. Every one of them." He paused. "You can't fix that. You know that. But you can prevent the next version of it in the next Pine Ridge if you give us what we need." Troy was quiet for a long time. "If I do this," he said finally, "I'm not doing it for them. I want to be clear about that." Marcus nodded. "Okay." I'm doing it because this. Troy glanced at the walls, the fluorescent light. The metal door is what I have, and 14 is better than 22. That's an honest reason, Marcus said. Troy picked up the pen on the table beside the document. It was an ordinary ballpoint pen, the institutional kind that comes in boxes of 50. It felt in his hand heavier than anything he had ever held. He signed. Marcus folded the document and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood. He went to the door and knocked for the guard. At the door, Troy said, "The other towns, are you going to get them?" Marcus paused with his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "That's what I do," he said. The guard opened the door. Marcus walked out into the institutional corridor, his footsteps steady and unhurried on the concrete floor, and Troy watched him go until the door closed and there was nothing left to watch. He sat in the empty visitation room for a long moment. Then he folded his hands on the metal table in exactly the same posture he had watched Jerome Tate use in the conference room in Pine Ridge, and he sat with what he had done and what it had cost, and what was left. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. 6 months after the sentencing on a Tuesday morning in June, Jerome Tate drove from his apartment on Clement Street to the Mercer County DMV office on Broadmoor Avenue, and he sat in one of the plastic chairs along the wall with a ticket stub that said G47, and he waited. He had been waiting in various configurations for 14 months. This particular waiting was different. This waiting had an end built into it. When the display screen showed G47 and the clerk called his name, he walked to the window and he slid his paperwork across the counter. The DOJ letter, the court order. Vacating his conviction, the application for reinstatement of his commercial driver's license, and the clerk, a middle-aged woman named Sharon, reviewed the documents with the professional thoroughness of someone who processes 100 cases a week and gave no indication that this one was different from any other. Then she looked up at him. "Mr. Tate," she said, "your CDL is being reinstated with full privileges. Your driving record will reflect no conviction for the incident of 14 months ago. As far as the state of Alabama is concerned, it never happened." She slid a laminated card across the counter. Jerome picked it up. He looked at it. His name, his photo, his DEL classification. Clean, unencumbered. The official laminated version of what had always been true. His hands were shaking, not from fear from the specific muscular response of a body that has been braced against something for so long that when the thing is removed, the bracing has nowhere to go. He walked out into the June morning and stood in the parking lot for a moment, the card in his hand, and he called his mother. She answered on the second ring. He said, "Mama, I got it back." A pause. Then Dorothy Tate's voice, 71 years old, a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and made sweet potato pie from scratch for 60 years, said, "Good. Now come home for dinner. I'm making your favorite." He drove to Birmingham that afternoon to the headquarters of Southeast Corridor Logistics, whose hiring manager, a man named Dave Okonkwo, who had read about the Pine Ridge case in the Birmingham News and had made a note to himself, had called Jerome's number 3 months earlier and left a message that began, "Mr. Tate, my name is Dave, and I've been looking for a driver with your experience." Jerome had called back. They had spoken for 40 minutes. Jerome had the interview which went well, and a second interview which went better, and a job offer that arrived in the mail on a Thursday afternoon, and that Jerome had read 4 times before he was certain of what it said. He was starting Monday. Birmingham to Memphis, regular schedule, union pay, full benefits a day, cab that smelled like new upholstery. He drove back through Pine Ridge on the way home. He had not planned to stop, but when he passed the north end of Route 9 and saw the spot where the Colton billboard had stood, he pulled over. He got out of his car and he stood on the shoulder and he looked at the empty sky above the vacant lot. The truss had been removed. The post had been cut off at ground level. The lot had been mowed. There was nothing there except grass and a square patch of paler earth where the foundation had been, and above it the flat Alabama sky. He stood there for a few minutes. Calvin Reese's garage was 200 yards north. Calvin was standing in the open bay door watching a customer pull out, and he happened to see Jerome standing on the shoulder of Route 9 looking at nothing in particular. He raised his hand. Jerome raised his back. Nothing more needed to be said. The two men who understood the full weight of what had happened here, standing 200 yards apart in the Alabama morning, had communicated everything necessary in that silent exchange. 23 years of a town looking away, and then one phone call that took the courage of a lifetime, and then 11 months of careful federal work, and then today, the sea where the billboard had been, and Jerome Tate standing on the shoulder of Route 9 with a CDL in his pocket, and a road that was his to drive. Calvin watched Jerome get back in his car and pull out. He turned back to the garage. He walked to the tool chest and pulled out the diagnostic reader for the Silverado in Bay 2. He got back to work. The thing about Pine Ridge now, Calvin thought running the reader along the Silverado's OBD port was a kind of quiet that had replaced a different kind of quiet. The old quiet had been the quiet of suppression, the sound of a community that had learned not to say certain things to certain people. This new quiet was different. It was ordinary quiet, the quiet of a town where the background hum of fear had been removed, and what was left was just ordinary life, which was imperfect and had its own problems, but was not organized around the particular problem of Troy Harlan. Calvin did not take that for granted. He had been in Pine Ridge long enough to know that ordinary life required maintenance the same as any machine. Left unattended, it developed problems. The problems accumulated. One day you looked up and realized the problem had been there for 20 years and nobody had said anything because the cost of saying something had been too high. The Silverado needed new rear O2 sensors. Calvin wrote it up. He went to the parts shelf. On Monday morning, Jerome drove to Southeast Corridor Logistics and went through orientation and signed his paperwork and climbed into the day cab that smelled like new upholstery. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the freight yard and the scale and the gate and the road beyond it. He turned the key. The engine caught a deep, clean, powerful sound. He pulled out of the yard. He got on the highway, set his cruise control at 65, and drove north through the Alabama morning with the windows down and the radio on a country station he didn't particularly like, but didn't change because the music was there and the road was empty, and his hands on the wheel were the hands of a man who had a legitimate reason to be exactly where he was. He drove for 2 hours without stopping. There was not a police car in his mirror the entire way. That night, he called Darius. His son was finishing his sophomore year, 15 now, taller than Jerome had expected with his mother's cheekbones and his grandfather's eyes. Jerome told him about the CDL, about the job, about standing on the shoulder of Route 9 looking at the place where the billboard had been. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, are you going to be okay now?" Jerome thought about the question. He thought about what okay contained the full measure of what it had cost to lose, and the full measure of what it meant to have some of it returned, and the specific distance between those two things that no court order could entirely close. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to be okay. It's going to take a while to feel like it." "But yeah." "Good," Darius said. "You tell your mama I'll have your support payment to her by the 1st. I got a real job now." "I know. She already knows. She called Grandma this afternoon." Jerome laughed. It came out more easily than he expected. "Your grandmother. She was already making the pie." He was still smiling when he hung up. The Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award ceremony was held on a Wednesday afternoon in a room at the Department of Justice. That was designed for exactly this purpose. High ceilings, the seal on the wall, chairs arranged with institutional precision, the weight of consequence present in the architecture. Marcus and Deja received their awards from the Attorney General in a room that included their direct supervisors, several members of the FBI's Civil Rights Unit, and 2 reporters from legal trade publications who had covered the Pine Ridge case as a study in federal anti-corruption methodology. The ceremony was approximately 20 minutes. The Attorney General shook their hands and said the right things about courage and dedication and the rule of law. There were photographs. Vivian Cross was there. She had flown up from Atlanta that morning and would fly back that evening, and had said when Marcus saw her in the hallway beforehand, "This is a good day. Enjoy it." She had meant it, which was not something she said often. She was already in the car on the way to the airport that evening thinking about the next case, which was in a different state and involved a different kind of institutional failure and would require different tools. But she had learned over 30 years to let a good day be a good day before she moved on to what came next. She was still working on it, but she was better at it than she used to be. Afterward, Marcus and Deja walked out of the building into a June afternoon that was warm and clear and completely indifferent to the significance of the preceding 20 minutes. They walked to the parking structure 3 blocks away without particular urgency. Deja had taken off her heels and was carrying them. Marcus had loosened his tie. The medals were in velvet boxes in Marcus's jacket pocket, bumping gently against his ribs with each step. They didn't talk for the first 2 blocks. The city moved around them, the particular anonymity of a Washington afternoon full of people who each had their own version of an important day and were moving through it with the same urgency and the same invisibility. Then Deja said, "I want to tell you something I should have told you 11 months ago, when I asked for this case." Marcus waited. "The file I found in Dad's closet," she said. "It wasn't just a document. There was a note with it in his handwriting. He had written it sometime after 1987. I couldn't tell exactly when, but sometime in the early 90s when we were young enough that he felt he needed to hide it from us. It was addressed to me and Marcus." She paused. "It said, 'I need you both to understand that what happened to me happened to a lot of people. And the only thing I know for certain is that the people who can do something about it have to decide that it's worth the cost. I hope you'll decide that.'" Marcus did not say anything for a moment. They walked. "He knew," Marcus said. "He always knew what we were going to do," Deja said. "I think he knew before we did." She looked at the sidewalk ahead. "He never told us about that stop because he didn't want us to be angry about him specifically. He wanted us to understand the pattern, the scope of it. He thought if we were angry about him, we would be smaller than what the problem required." She paused. "That note was not about what happened to him. It was instructions for what to do about all of it." They came into the parking structure and the temperature dropped 5 degrees in the way that concrete structures generate their own climate. Their car was on level 2, the dark blue government SUV with the bulletproof glass and the encrypted radio and the case file for Mississippi already loaded on Marcus's tablet. Deja put her shoes back on. Marcus opened the case file. The Mississippi matter was 3 counties. A sheriff named Earl Dayton who had been systematically challenging voter registration applications in black majority precincts, using procedural objections that were one by one defensible, but whose pattern constituted something that the Voting Rights Act had specific language for. It was not extortion. It was not assault. It was quieter than Pine Ridge and, in some ways, more durable. The kind of institutional harm that operates below the threshold of dramatic incident that doesn't produce a moment anyone can point to, only an accumulation of small denials that add up to the same thing. It was going to take longer. It was going to require different tools. "This one's more complicated," Marcus said. "Good," Deja said. She settled into the passenger seat. "Simple ones don't need us." Marcus started the engine. The car filled with the low hum of it, the particular sound of something that works and intends to continue working. "Do you think Dad knew it would take this long?" Deja asked. The note was from sometime in the early 90s. "That's more than 30 years. Marcus pulled out of the parking space. He thought about his father, a man he remembered as quiet in the specific way that Deja had described the two-handed grip the turned-down radio at county lines. A man who had carried something for 30 years without putting it down, and who had, in the privacy of a shoebox in a closet, found a way to pass it forward without making it about his own wound. "I think he knew it would take a lifetime," Marcus said. "I think he was counting on it taking a lifetime. Otherwise, he wouldn't have written it to us." He paused. He wanted it to be ours, not his. He wanted us to come to it clean, not because we were angry about what happened to him, but because we had chosen it. Deja looked out the window at the parking structure's concrete columns at the light between them. "He was very patient," she said. "He had to be," Marcus said. "County lines." They came out of the parking structure into the afternoon. The Washington sun was direct and bright, and Marcus flipped down the visor. Part 2. Mississippi. "Mississippi," Deja said. "Mississippi." Marcus confirmed. He put the car in gear and pulled into traffic, and the city moved around them the way cities move, indifferent and continuous, full of 10,000 private reckonings happening simultaneously at different speeds, some of them arriving at their conclusions today, and some of them still decades away. On the tablet between them, the Mississippi case file glowed with the particular blue light of a problem that had not yet been solved. It would not be solved this week or this month. It would not produce a single dramatic stop on a country highway, a camera recording a warrant executed in the morning hours. It would produce meetings and filings and appeals and counter-appeals and long drives through counties that looked from the highway like they had no particular urgency to them, and that were beneath that surface doing exactly what counties like Pine Ridge had been doing for 20 years, organizing themselves around who was permitted to have access to what, and ensuring that the answer remained consistent with what it had always been. But Marcus and Deja had 11 months of practice at patience. They had their father's instructions carried in a shoebox for 3 decades. They had Calvin Reese, who had driven to Birmingham and sat in a federal office and told his story to a stranger because someone had to. They had Jerome Tate, who had walked into the Pine Ridge Police Department for the second time and said, "What do you need from me?" They had the road. The road went south. Troy Harlan is serving year 2 of a reduced 14-year sentence at a federal correctional facility in West Virginia, under the cooperation agreement he signed in the prison visitation room. His law enforcement pension was forfeited. His home was seized under civil asset forfeiture and the proceeds distributed among the identified victims of the Pine Ridge extortion scheme. He has not had contact with his daughter since the week of his sentencing. He works a maintenance detail 4 hours a day, sweeping corridors in the administrative wing. He does not look up when people pass. Arthur Colton was sentenced to 8 years. He is serving his sentence at a minimum security facility in Georgia. His billboard was taken down the same afternoon he was arrested. The lot has not been released. Chief Raymond Dolby was sentenced to 11 years. Judge Preston Waverly received 14. Dr. Raymond Sills lost his medical license and is serving 6 years. Mayor Curtis Fenn received 3 years and a substantial fine. Jerome Tate's conviction was formally vacated. He received restitution of $67,000 from the seized assets of the Pine Ridge scheme, approximately 1 year's lost income. The rest of what he lost, the years, the marriage, the house, the mornings, his son woke up uncertain about his father, cannot be quantified by a court order. He drives a freight route from Birmingham to Memphis. He is current on his support payments. He makes his mother's birthday dinner every year. He calls Darius twice a week. Calvin Reese still runs his garage on the north end of Pine Ridge. Business is about the same. He no longer recognizes the sound of Troy Harlan's cruiser because there is no longer a Troy Harlan's cruiser to recognize. He says the quiet where that sound used to be took some getting used to. He is getting used to it. The Colton billboard post was removed completely 6 weeks after the arrest. Someone planted a dogwood tree in the spot where the foundation had been. In April, it blooms white. What happened in Pine Ridge did not make the national news for long. A week perhaps of sustained attention during which the usual commentary played out the debates about systemic versus individual failure. The comparisons to other cases, the question of whether this kind of thing was exceptional or routine, which was itself a question that answered itself. If you lived in certain communities, in certain counties, in certain states. Then the news moved on the way. News moves on to the next thing. But in Pine Ridge itself, the reckoning continued at the speed of actual change, which is slower than news cycles and more durable. The department brought in a new interim chief from the State Bureau of Investigation, a woman named Patricia Howell, 43, who had spent 12 years running community policing programs in Jefferson County and who arrived in Pine Ridge with the specific intention of understanding what the community needed from its police department before deciding what the police department should do. She held 4 town hall meetings in her first month. She listened more than she spoke. She did not promise things she was not sure she could deliver. The 4th town hall was held at Calvin Reese's church, which was the only venue large enough. 83 people attended, more than Pine Ridge had seen in a public meeting since the high school football championship in 2017. People who had not spoken to any official institution in years came and sat in the folding chairs and said what they had been carrying. Some of it was about Troy specifically. Most of it was about the longer accumulation. The stops, the looking away, the calculation that had governed everyday life for decades. Chief Howell took notes. She did not interrupt. At the end of the meeting, a woman stood up who had not been on the list of attendees. She was in her mid-30s with 2 children sitting on either side of her who were old enough to be still and young enough to be curious about the ceiling lights. She said, "I just want to know if this is real. I want to know if it is going to hold." Chief Howell looked at her across the rows of folding chairs. She said, "I cannot promise you it will. What I can promise is that I will not look away from anything, and that if I do, I want you to be here to tell me." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she sat down. It was not a solution. It was not even close to enough. It was the beginning of a different kind of conversation, which is not the same thing as justice, but which is sometimes the first necessary condition for it. After the 4th town hall, as people filed out into the parking lot, and the evening air, an officer from the department, young 24, had been on the force for 8 months, held the door for an elderly man who was moving slowly with a cane. The young officer said, without being asked, without calculation, "Take your time, sir. I've got you." The elderly man, who had been stopped by Troy Harlan 3 times in 6 years and had paid across those 3 stops a combined $480 to avoid charges he had not committed, stopped and looked at the young officer. The young officer looked back, open, unhurried. The elderly man continued through the door. He did not say anything. He had been in Pine Ridge for 60 years, and he had learned that some things required observation before they required comment. He would watch. He would see whether the patience this young officer had shown at a door on a Tuesday night was the kind of patience that persisted or the kind that ran out when it was inconvenient. He would see. That was the thing about change in small places. It required witnesses who were willing to stay long enough to see whether it held. The dogwood tree someone planted at the billboard site bloomed for the first time in April of the following year. It bloomed white, which is what dogwoods do in Alabama in April, which is one of the things Alabama does well and quietly without being asked to. Calvin Reese passed it every morning on his way to the garage. He did not stop. But he looked, and the road, Route 9, running north and south through Mercer County, connecting Pine Ridge to everything beyond it, was just a road. It went where it went. It had no memory of what had happened on its shoulder on a Tuesday in August of the blue lights and the hot gravel, and 2 people standing with their hands visible and their composure intact, prepared for what came next. The road was just a road, but the people who drove it knew what had happened. And knowing changed what the driving felt like in the specific small way that truth changes the texture of ordinary things. They drove it with their hands easy on the wheel. He thought the badge on his chest gave him the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. He was wrong. And the hardest kind of justice is the kind that arrives not in a flash of drama, but in the slow, patient work of people who decided that it was worth the cost.